Hello, welcome to this episode of English with Mr. Harding. And thank you so much for all of your views. Thank you so much for all of your comments. Thank you so much for liking, for sharing, for subscribing to this channel, because it means so much to me. And it's so exciting for me that this is actually helping you and it's being useful to you, which is why I set this thing up in the first place. Can I encourage you, if you are enjoying this content, if this is useful to you, if this is helpful to you, please do share it on Facebook. It's the best way to get all of this content out to as many people as possible so that they can be helped as well as you. Thank you so much. And remember, as I said right at the very beginning, English with Mr. Harding, we are here for you. So in the comments, if there are topics, if there are bits of English that you really struggle with and you really want some help with, feel free to put those questions down in the comment section, and then that will allow me to tackle those topics in future episodes so that we can help some people, because let me help you. If you've got a question, I can let you know that other people will have that question as well. Well, moving on to today's session on what we're going to be talking about, and we are in the middle of a series that I am calling I'd Like to Get Better At. And in this series, we're covering all of those moments, maybe in an English lesson, where your teacher has introduced a brand new topic and you've maybe spent a week investigating it, but you just feel like you would like more time. In other words, you'd like to be able to say, I'd like to get better at, and then whatever that concept is. And today I want to tackle the subject of structure. So today's episode is entitled, I'd like to get better at structure. Now, if you've not been with us before, if you've not viewed the way that we do each session, let me break it down for you. There are 3 simple ways in which we're going to approach every single session, and every single session will run like this. The first thing that we were going to do is we're going to define the concept. So in this case, we're going to define structure. And then I'm going to explain that and exemplify that to you by going through with you with a worked example so you can see how you would apply that particular concept in a real life worked example. And then at the end of every single session, you'll notice attached there are going to be some worksheets which will allow you personally to go away and to apply the concept that we've just talked about. And as I've said already, feel free when you're going through those, comment on those, ask questions. It'll enable you to get the most out of every single session. So let's start. Structure. Well, the first thing that we need to think about is, what is structure? When we talk about structure in English, what do we mean? And here's the big idea that I want you to write down. This will be on the notes as well. Structure. When we're talking about it in English, here's what we mean. Structure means the order and the point of view the writer chooses to tell the story from. I wonder, maybe when you're with your friends, have you ever found yourself telling them a story? Now, I can bet that whenever you tell someone a story, maybe it was something funny that happened to you, what you'll often do is you'll edit out certain details. And the reason that you do that is because when you're telling that story to your friends, you realize that there are certain details from the story that aren't really important. So what you do is you edit them out. Sometimes, maybe if you've told the story a couple of times, you might decide to tell the story in a slightly different order. Maybe you've realized that if you tell it in a certain way, it might be funnier, it might be more exciting, it might be more interesting for other people to listen to. And what you're doing there is you're deliberately thinking about the order in which you tell the story so that it can be most effective. For example, if it's a funny story, you're thinking about the way in which you tell the story so it's most funny. If, for example, you were telling a scary story, you'd tell the story in the order that is going to help you create as much tension and as much fear as possible. Because after all, you're telling a scary story, so that's what you want for your audience, the people who are listening to you. And the important point to take away from this is this, that whenever we tell stories, we actually tell stories in a deliberate order. Now, don't misunderstand me. When you're telling a story to your friends, you probably won't think in that much detail. However, when it comes to writing, it's a little bit different. When writers tell a story, they're thinking very much, because they've had the time to, they're thinking about what is the best order and the best way in which I can tell my story. And when they're thinking that, here's who they're thinking about. They're thinking about you, the reader. Because at the end of the day, a writer's job is to create a story that captivates your attention and keeps you interested. How many of you have maybe had to listen to a friend telling a story and they hadn't really thought about how they told it at all, and it wasn't very interesting? In actual fact, the only reason that you listened was because you're their friend. Writers, because they're doing this for their job, they can't afford to do that. So they have to think very, very carefully about the order in which they tell their story. Now, you may, for example, have picked up a novel whereby perhaps the story begins some point in the future, and then the rest of the entire story is something we call a flashback. In other words, maybe the story starts a really exciting and important and intense moment. Imagine, for example, the main character is stood on the end of a cliff, and it seems like they're about to throw themselves into the sea below. As you read that, you're asking yourself many different questions. You're probably wondering, what is it that led up to them being in this situation where they're standing on the end of a cliff anyway, and what's made them come to that place where they think that jumping off the cliff is the only thing that they can do? Well, a good storyteller would then give you the flashback. What they're then doing is they're filling in the holes, helping you to understand how the character got to this particular place in the story where they decided that this is their only option. In many ways, sometimes the writer will take advantage of this. Maybe actually they're throwing themselves off this particular cliff, but not to die. Maybe down beneath in the sea, there's actually a secret hideout or something like this, and this is actually an adventure story. And in that case, what the writer's done is they've actually tricked you. They've made you think one thing was happening where actually something very different was taking place. The important point to consider here is the order in which the writer tells the story. And so, as I've said, what is structure? Structure is the order and the point of view from which the writer chooses to tell the story. Let me give you a practical example. Now, I'm going to read from a story. It's called The Clan of the Cave Bear. It's quite a long story, but it will appear as well, so you can scan along with me. And then we're going to investigate it, we're going to look at it, and we're going to look at it from the point of view of structure. So as I read, I want you to consider, how has the writer told this story? What are the different points in the story? So there's about 4 sections, and the writer moves us through these different 4 sections, leading towards a cliffhanger right at the very end. Let's start reading the story. The naked child ran out of the hide-covered lean-to towards the rocky beach at the bend of the small river. It didn't occur to her to look back. Nothing in her experience ever gave her reason to doubt the shelter and those within it would be there when she returned. She splashed into the river and felt the rocks and the sand shift under her feet as the shore fell off sharply. She dived into the cold water and came up spluttering, then reached out with sure strokes for the steep opposite bank. She had learned to swim before she had learned to walk, and at 5 was at ease in the water. Swimming was often the only way a river could be crossed. The girl played for a while, swimming back and forth, then let the current float her downstream. Where the river widened and bubbled over the rocks, she stood up and waded to shore, then walked back to the beach and began sorting pebbles. She had just put a stone on top of a pile of especially pretty ones when the earth began to tremble. The child looked with surprise as the stone rolled down of its own accord, and stared in wonder at the small pyramid of pebbles shaking and levelling themselves. Only then did she become aware she was shaking too, but she was still more confused than apprehensive. She glanced around, trying to understand why her universe had altered in some inexplicable way. The earth was not supposed to move. The small river, which moments before had flowed smoothly, was rolling with choppy waves that splashed over its banks as the rocking stream bed moved at cross purposes to the current, dredging mud up from the bottom. Brush close by the upstream banks quivered, animated by unseen movements at the roots, and downstream boulders bobbed in unaccustomed agitation. Beyond them, stately conifers of the forest into which the stream flowed lurched grotesquely. A giant pine near the bank, its roots exposed and their hold weakened by the spring runoff, leaned towards the opposite shore. With a crack, it gave way and crashed to the ground, bridging the turbid watercourse, and lay shaking on the unsteady earth. The girl started at the sound of the falling tree. Her stomach churned and tightened into a knot as fear brushed the edge of her mind. She tried to stand but fell back, unbalanced by the sickening swaying. She tried again, managed to pull herself up, and stood unsteadily, afraid to take a step. As she started towards the hide-covered shelter, set back from the stream, she felt a low rumble rise to a terrifying roar. A sour stench of wetness and rot issued from a cracked opening in the ground, like the reek of a morning breath from the yawning earth. She stared uncomprehendingly at dirt and rocks and small trees falling into the widening gap as the cooled shell of the molten planet cracked into the convulsion. The lean-to, perched on the far edge of the abyss, tilted as half the solid ground beneath it pulled away. The slender ridge pole teetered undecidedly, then collapsed and disappeared into the deep hole, taking its hide cover and all it contained with it. The girl trembled in wide-eyed horror as the foul-breathing, gaping maw swallowed everything that had given meaning and security to the 5 short years of her life. Well, that was a really exciting story, wasn't it? And as we look at that story, and I want to encourage you, I did on my first episode, I talked about summary and the ability to summarize. And that's a skill that you're going to need right now. Because when it comes to talking about structure, you need to be able to talk about the order, but to be able to talk about the order, you need to be able to summarize in simple terms the order of events that are taking place in this story. So if we look at this story, what are the order of events? And if we look at it, we can break it down quite simply into a number of sections. For those of you, I wonder, maybe if some of you are into designing graphic novels, one of the ways that I often help my students do this is I ask them, if this was a comic strip, draw some boxes, and in those boxes, write down the main events in the order that they take place. So right now, I'm just going to do it in bullet points, but if you wanted to, you could draw it, and maybe that's a way visually that would help you to understand what the order of the story is. So the first thing to notice about this story is the very ordinary way in which it starts. At the very beginning of the story, the main character, who we're told is a little over 5 years old, is actually just playing in a stream. So we can put that down. We can say the girl is playing in a stream. Now, the important thing to notice at this particular point is that it seems very much like this is a very ordinary and everyday activity that the girl would be involved in. We're told, for example, that the girl has been swimming longer than she can walk. In other words, water is something that she's very, very familiar with. At this particular point in the story, there's no real indication that anything out of the ordinary is going to take place. Apart from, and I wonder if you noticed it, it says, in the second line, it says, nothing in her experience ever gave her reason to doubt the shelter and those within it would be there when she returned. Now, this is a particular type of structure device we call foreshadowing. What it's doing here, what the writer's doing here is, in this sentence, he's hinting at the idea that maybe at some point in the future, actually everything that's secure and seems stable to this child at this point is going to be taken away. So the girl's playing in the stream. Then what we see is we see a transition, and this is something really important to look for when we're thinking about structure. When we're thinking about the order, what you really want to ask yourself is, what is the writer focusing your attention on? In the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, the writer is focusing our attention, that's the reader, on the fact that the girl is playing in the stream. But then there's a transition. I wonder, did you notice it? Maybe look back at the extract right now in front of you and see if you too can spot it. It's at the end of the 3rd paragraph. Let me read it out to you. Here's what it says. She had just put a stone on top of a pile of especially pretty ones when the earth began to tremble. So this is the indication that actually the focus is shifting away from the girl onto a separate event that is taking place. And at this particular point, the only thing that we know is that the earth is beginning to tremble. So we can write that down. The earth begins to tremble. So that's almost like the second shift that takes place here. Everything's very ordinary, and then the writer cleverly introduces something that disturbs the peace and the tranquility of this scene. Something out of the ordinary is now taking place. Interestingly though, the writer doesn't make it terrifying immediately. In actual fact, if you scan on to the next paragraph, you'll notice that we're told, and maybe you can find this too, we're told that the girl was more confused than apprehensive. Now, maybe you don't know what the word apprehensive means. It just means worried or concerned. So, to begin with, you'll notice the girl is more confused than she is worried. In other words, although something unusual is taking place, she doesn't seem to be afraid at this point. However, the next step that we need to recognize is that the way in which the writer describes the next series of events and the next shifts, actually what they do is they create a sense of fear and terror inside of the girl. And this is hand in hand with descriptions that clearly show us that things that shouldn't really move suddenly start moving quite dramatically. For example, we're told that a bunch of conifers, now those are very big and strong trees, those big and strong trees suddenly start uprooting themselves and moving from the earth. I wonder, have you understood at this point what's actually happening? Yes, that's right. What the writer's actually describing here is an earthquake. That's why big and very solid objects are suddenly moving in uncharacteristic ways. So the next shift that we can then begin to talk about is the shift number 3. We can say large and normally immovable objects, immovable meaning that they just don't normally move. Objects begin to move. The girl is now afraid. And then the 4th and the final shift that the writer takes us through. You'll notice in the first paragraph, it referenced the lean-to. In other words, the home that the girl normally has. And very interestingly, the very last image that the writer leaves us with is once again focused on this lean-to, or this shelter which she lives in. And the final image of this particular extract is that lean-to, that cave that she's known since she was born, the place that she's called home. She watches it disappear into the abyss of the earth. In other words, a giant hole has opened up because of the earthquake, and her home is swallowed by it. And that's what we can then put. We can say the girl watches her home disappear into a large hole left by the earthquake. There we go. Now, when we were doing summarizing, you can understand why it's really important to be able to break down a larger piece of text into its most important points. And in this case, when we're looking at structure, we've now got the structure of this extract. There's a lot more paragraphs than this, but basically here's what happens. Structure point number 1, the girl is playing in a stream. That's the first focus. There's then a focus shift, and it focuses away from the girl and onto what's happening in the earth. And number 2, the earth begins to tremble. Then number 3, the large and normally immovable objects begin to move, and the girl is now afraid. And you'll notice that the moves of the earth are actually connected to the feelings of the girl. So the girl, at the very beginning of the story, she seems happy, content, everything seems very ordinary. In the second focus shift, the girl is confused, but she's not at this point afraid. By the time we get to the third structure shift, actually, she's now afraid. And by the fourth structure shift, she's left without anything of her home there at all. I wonder what she's feeling at this point. She's obviously going to be feeling terrified and afraid, but also I think she's going to feel lost and confused because everything that she's ever known in life has been taken away from her. And you'll notice in many ways, the girl is the thing that links all the different structure devices together. Now, when it comes to talking about structure, the next step, once we've recognized the different movements, the different episodes within this longer extract, we need to ask ourselves a really important question. And this is something that's really important for any one of you. If you are doing reading, you need to then ask yourself the question, why does the writer tell the story in this order? Now, this is a skill that's particularly important in GCSE English. In GCSE English language at this moment, there's a question that actually deals with structure, and it asks you to be able to not only identify what the structure devices are and the structure shifts are, but it asks you to be able to explain why you think the writer may have ordered his story or her story in this particular way. Now, even if you're not doing GCSE at the moment, this is a really important exercise. I wonder, maybe some of you in Key Stage 3 out there, maybe some of you are 11, 12, 13, maybe you think of yourself as a budding writer. This is a really good exercise to do for yourself, where you look at an extract like this and you try and ask yourself the question, I wonder why the writers organised it in this particular way. And then once you've thought about that a little bit, it may help you when you're telling your own stories. What's the best way to tell the story? Could you do it in a different way? Looking at this story, you would probably learn a lot about how to build tension. You'll notice the writer hints that the danger is coming before the danger comes. That's a technique you can use as well. Can you remember what we called it? That's right. We called it foreshadowing. It's where you put in a hint or a clue or something that's about to take place in your story before it actually happens. You'll notice as well in this particular structure that actually the girl's emotions become more intense. She's not afraid to begin with. She's just a little bit worried and she's more confused than anything else, but she becomes more worried. The question is, why do you think the writer does this? Now, when I look at this and I'm thinking about the effect here, I want to see the whole thing as interconnected. In other words, yes, there are 4 different episodes here, but they all link together, leading towards this cliffhanger at the end. And the cliffhanger that's left, and it's leaving us with a question as readers. We're wondering, what happens to the girl next? Her home has been completely destroyed. Well, here's the obvious question. Where is she going to sleep tonight? Is there an adult around her that can actually help her? Obviously, she's very, very young. I wonder, if her shelter's been destroyed, does that mean other adults that she knows, their shelters have been destroyed too? Will she be able to find them? All of these questions are the kinds of questions that should be in your mind when you come to the end of this extract. So remember, the writer's done this deliberately so that you are interested in the story and you're more importantly interested in the main character, the girl. You want to find out what happens to her next. Is she going to live? If she is going to live, how is she going to survive? And it's those kinds of questions that are going through our mind as we read this. And so, just to summarize here, when we're talking about structure, you need to do two things. The first thing is you need to use the skill of summary. Look over the extract, break it up into the mini episodes, just like I've done with this particular example. What happens in each one of those episodes? And pay particular attention to the transition moments. What is it that the writer did that changed the focus from one area to another area? And try and see if you can spot all of those different transition shifts when they happen. And then the second part. This is where you want to answer the question, why did the writer do this? So in this case, and this particular example, it's actually really clear why the writer's done this. The writer does this to create tension. Because at the beginning, the girl is not in danger. But as the passage goes on, one of the things that you should be tracking and one of the things you should notice in all the different episode changes is that the girl becomes in danger increasingly so. So the danger gradually builds and increases. So every single time there's a transition or there's a focus shift in this particular extract, it actually puts the girl in greater danger than she was previously. At the very end of the extract, although it's quite clear that the earthquake hasn't killed her, she is still in danger. Remember, she's young. We don't know if any other adult has survived, and therefore the question that goes through our mind is, the simple question is she going to survive? This is a cliffhanger. It's putting us in a place where we're asking a question as a reader, and even though we may not ask it out loud, we ask it inside of ourselves, and what it does is it encourages us to read further into the story, to find out what happens to the girl. So that's how we talk about structure. And there's lots and lots of ways in which you can practice this. And right now, I'd encourage you, once you finish this video, go and look at the resources. I've created one for Key Stage 3, that's for children from ages 11 to 14, and then one for Key Stage 4, that's from children from the age of 14 to 16. And I want you to look over those two different resources, depending on what age you are, and have a go yourself. Can you, to begin with, spot the different focus shifts, the episodes that take place inside of the extract, and then can you explain why you think the writer may have chosen them? And can I encourage you? Lead with your ideas. You try and ask yourself the question, if you were writing this extract, why would you have ordered it in this way? And then a really fun thing I would like you to try on your worksheets is once you've read through your extract, you have a go at telling the story yourself, but maybe tell it from a different point of view or put the story in a different order. And maybe you can create a very different effect to the one that the writer did. Remember, creativity, asking questions, really trying to understand why a writer is doing something is at the cornerstone of us as being good readers. When we ask intelligent questions, it will lead towards intelligent ideas and intelligent answers. Thank you so much for joining me today on this particular episode. Thank you so much for joining me here, and thank you so much for sharing and for liking and for commenting. And can I just encourage you one last time, if there is something in English that you are doing currently and that you don't understand it, maybe it's, I don't understand what nouns are, maybe it's, my teacher was talking about metaphors, I really don't understand what metaphors are. My teacher talked about this thing called personification, can you explain it to me? I'd so love to do more videos helping you and equipping you and empowering you to become a really great independent reader, someone who is capable of understanding how writers write so that you can write your own great stories, but also so that you're able to access anything that you are given. I can't wait to see you the next time on English with Mr. Harding. Take care.